They say life has a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. I used to think betrayal was something that happened to other people, not me. But there I was, standing in my workshop, gripping my wrench so tightly I could feel the metal bite into my skin. The words Claire had just uttered hung in the air like a dark cloud. She didn't even sugarcoat it. She was cheating on me, and not just with anyone. With her boss, Richard. My wife, the woman I'd loved for 25 years, admitted it like she was confessing to eating the last slice of pie. Calm, rational, almost as if she had rehearsed it. She even had reasons. Reasons. She said it wasn't about me. Not really. It was about her wanting something more. More? What the hell does that even mean after everything we've been through together? I thought we had a good life. I might not be some big shot lawyer like her, but I've worked my ass off to build my business and provide for our family. A simple mechanic, she called me. Is that all I was to her now? I stared at Claire as she sat across from me at our dining table, her hands clasped together like she was bracing herself for my reaction. Her expression wasn't exactly apologetic. It was calculated, like she had already weighed the pros and cons of her confession and decided it was worth the risk. That hurt more than anything else. It wasn't just the betrayal of her body. It was the betrayal of our history, of everything we had built together. "You're awfully quiet, Tom," she said, her voice soft, almost pitying. "I know this is a lot to process, but I want to be honest with you." Honest. That was rich coming from her. Honesty would have been telling me she was unhappy before jumping into bed with Richard. Honesty would have been working through whatever she felt was missing instead of sneaking around behind my back. But no, she waited until she was caught, or nearly caught, to come clean. And even then, it wasn't because she felt guilty. No, it was because Richard told her it was better to get ahead of it before I found out from someone else. Damage control, he called it. As if my marriage was some PR nightmare she needed to manage. "I don't even know what to say to you right now, Claire," I said finally, my voice tight. "You're sitting here talking about honesty like it's some noble thing you're doing. But all I see is someone who's trying to justify what they've done." "I'm not trying to justify anything," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I just want you to understand where I'm coming from." Where she's coming from. Like I hadn't spent 25 years standing right by her side, supporting her dreams, raising our kids, putting in long hours at the shop so she could go to law school without worrying about money. I wanted to shout, to scream, to throw something, but I didn't. That wasn't me. I've never been the kind of man who loses his temper, and I wasn't about to start now. Not for her. Not for Richard. They didn't deserve to see me break. Instead, I got up and walked to the window, staring out at the street. A car drove by, its tires crunching on the gravel, and for a moment, I envied the driver. Whoever they were just going about their day, blissfully unaware of the storm raging inside me. "I need some time to think," I said finally, my voice calm but firm. "I can't do this right now." Claire nodded, her face unreadable. "Take all the time you need, Tom," she said, as if she were doing me a favor. "I'll be here when you're ready to talk." Her words felt like salt in an open wound. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I walked out of the room, out of the house, and into my workshop, the only place where I could think straight. My hands trembled as I picked up a wrench, and for the first time in my life, I felt like throwing it through the nearest wall. But I didn't. Instead, I sat down at my workbench, took a deep breath, and tried to figure out what the hell I was going to do. Claire might think she has all the power right now, but she doesn't know me as well as she thinks. She doesn't know the man I've become over the years, the strength I've built, not just in my hands but in my heart. She thinks she's already won. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. I sat in my workshop, hands clenched into fists, the metallic smell of grease and oil barely masking the rage simmering inside me. I needed time to think, but it seemed Claire and her boss, no, her lover, weren't planning to give me that luxury. Richard had decided to escalate things. Less than 24 hours after Claire's confession, he showed up at my workshop. Uninvited, unwelcome, and as I'd soon prove, unwise. The man walked in like he owned the place, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. His cologne was so strong it made my eyes water, and the smug smile plastered across his face told me everything I needed to know about him. He wasn't here to apologize. No, Richard was here to assert his dominance, to show me that he was the one in control. "Tom," he said, his voice oozing fake cordiality, "I'm glad we could meet. Claire told me you'd be upset, but I think we can sort this out like adults." "Sort this out? Like adults?" I wanted to laugh in his face, but I held back. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here," I said, keeping my voice steady. "What do you want?" Richard's smile widened, as if he had been waiting for that question. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers, laying them on my workbench like he was presenting some kind of masterpiece. "I thought it might be helpful to bring some clarity to the situation," he said, tapping the documents. "Claire and I have discussed this extensively, and we've come to a mutual understanding about how to proceed." I picked up the papers, skimming the first few pages. A divorce petition, an order to freeze my business accounts, restraining orders that would keep me away from my own home. The audacity of it all hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't just trying to end my marriage, they were trying to destroy me. "You're serious about this?" I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Dead serious," Richard replied, his tone dripping with condescension. "Look, Tom, I know this is hard for you to accept, but the truth is, Claire deserves better. She's an accomplished, intelligent woman. She's outgrown you, and that's okay. It happens. I'm just here to help her transition into the next phase of her life." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This man had the gall to stand in my workshop, insult me to my face, and act like he was doing me a favor by stealing my wife. My hand tightened around the wrench on my workbench, but I forced myself to let go. Not yet. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper. "And what about me?" I asked, crossing my arms. "What happens to the man who spent 25 years building a life with her? The man who raised her kids, supported her career, and loved her through everything?" Richard shrugged, as if my sacrifices were nothing more than a footnote in his story. "You'll adapt," he said casually. "You're a resourceful guy, Tom. You'll figure something out. Maybe this will be a good opportunity for you to grow, to become the man Claire always wanted you to be." The man Claire always wanted me to be. That line stuck with me. Richard wasn't just trying to take my wife. He was trying to rewrite our history, to turn me into the villain of a story I had spent decades writing with my blood, sweat, and tears. "I see," I said, forcing myself to stay calm. "And what if I don't agree to any of this?" Richard's smile faltered for a moment before he recovered. "Then I'll make sure you don't have a choice," he said, his voice hardening. "I have over 20 lawyers at my disposal, Tom. Family law, business law, you name it, they're experts in it. I will drown you in lawsuits. You won't even be able to afford a lawyer by the time I'm done with you." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And all the while, I'll be sleeping with Claire. You'll just have to accept it. That's the way this ends." I stared at him, the anger in my chest threatening to boil over. But instead of lashing out, I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he knows something his opponent doesn't. "You've got it all figured out, don't you?" I said. "Big man with your fancy lawyers and your expensive suits. But let me tell you something, Richard. The world doesn't run on paper. It runs on grit, determination, and knowing when to pick a fight." Richard looked confused, but I didn't give him a chance to respond. "Now, if you'll excuse me," I said, gesturing to the door. "I've got work to do." He hesitated for a moment before gathering his papers and leaving, his confidence shaken. I watched him go, my mind already racing with ideas. Richard thought he could intimidate me, that his money and power made him untouchable. But he had made one critical mistake. He underestimated me. The door to my workshop swung shut behind Richard, and for a long time, I just stood there, staring at the space he'd vacated. My mind was a mess of emotions. Anger, humiliation, sadness, but above all, determination. I'd heard enough of his smug condescension to last me a lifetime. Claire might think she had found her knight in shining armor, but all I saw was a snake in a suit. I dropped into my chair at the workbench, staring at the divorce papers he'd left behind. The gall of that man. Not only had he barged into my life uninvited, but he'd also tried to dictate the terms of my future as if he had already won. He thought he could reduce my marriage, my livelihood, my very existence, to a pile of legal jargon and threats. I didn't know what hurt more, his arrogance or the fact that Claire had gone along with it. For years, I had been the guy who kept his head down and did what needed to be done. I'd worked 12-hour days to make sure my family never went without. I'd swallowed my pride to support Claire's career, even when it meant taking a back seat to her ambitions. And now, here I was, the simple mechanic, being tossed aside like yesterday's trash because I wasn't good enough for her anymore. I looked around my workshop, at the tools I'd spent years collecting and the projects I'd poured my heart into. This was my sanctuary, my kingdom. Richard might have his lawyers and his boardrooms, but this was real. It was honest. Every scar on my hands, every aching muscle, was proof of the life I had built with my own 2 hands. And now some overpaid office jockey thought he could take it all away from me with a smirk and a handful of papers? Not a chance. I pushed the papers off the workbench, letting them scatter across the floor. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the kind of resolve that only comes when a man has been pushed too far. I wasn't going to let Richard or Claire dictate how this story ended. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But it wouldn't be the kind of fight they were expecting. I wasn't going to stoop to their level with sneaky tactics and underhanded schemes. No, my fight would be grounded in truth, in strength, and in the kind of resolve that can't be bought or sold. The first step was getting my head straight. I needed to think this through, plan my next move carefully. I wasn't going to let my emotions dictate my actions, no matter how tempting it was to drive to Richard's office and show him what a simple mechanic could really do. No, that's exactly what he wanted. He wanted me to lash out, to lose control, so he could paint me as the villain in his polished little narrative. I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I spent the rest of the day working on a client's car, letting the familiar rhythm of tightening bolts and checking fluids calm my nerves. Every turn of the wrench was a reminder of who I was, a man who didn't back down from a challenge, no matter how big or small. By the time the sun began to set, I had a plan. First, I would secure what mattered most, my kids. Claire and Richard could play their power games all they wanted, but they weren't going to use my children as pawns. I'd raised those kids, taught them how to ride bikes, cheered them on at soccer games. They knew who their father was, and I wasn't about to let anyone poison that. Second, I needed to protect my business. Richard had made it clear that he planned to come after everything I'd worked for, but he underestimated just how resourceful I could be. I didn't have a fleet of lawyers at my disposal, but I had something better, a network of loyal customers and friends who knew the value of hard work and integrity. If Richard thought he could crush me with a few legal tricks, he was in for a rude awakening. And finally, I needed to confront Claire, not as the man she thought she had outgrown, but as the man I had always been. I wasn't going to beg or plead for her to come back. I wasn't going to make excuses or try to justify the choices I had made over the years. I was going to stand tall and remind her exactly who she was walking away from. By the time I locked up the workshop for the night, I felt more like myself than I had in weeks. The anger was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but it was controlled now, focused. Richard thought he had the upper hand, but he didn't understand the kind of strength that comes from being pushed to the brink. He didn't know what it meant to fight for something real, something worth protecting. As I walked back to the house, the moon casting long shadows across the gravel driveway, I made a silent promise to myself. I would fight for my dignity, my family, and my future. And when this was all over, Richard would learn what it really meant to challenge a man like me. The day Richard walked into my workshop with his stack of papers and smug grin, I thought I had seen the height of his arrogance. But that was nothing compared to the confrontation that followed. It was the kind of moment that forces you to decide who you really are, and I didn't hesitate. It started with a knock on the workshop door. I didn't even need to look up to know it was him. That obnoxious cologne of his announced his presence before he could. This time, though, he wasn't smiling. He was smirking. There's a difference, and it's the kind of thing that sets a man's blood boiling. He wasn't just here to intimidate me. He wanted to humiliate me. Back so soon, Richard? I said, barely glancing up from the carburetor I was working on. I didn't give him the satisfaction of standing up or showing any sign that his presence rattled me. "Tom," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I thought I'd stop by to finalize a few things. Claire and I have discussed the next steps, and I wanted to make sure you understood your options." He placed another stack of papers on my workbench, this time with a pin perched neatly on top. I didn't touch them. Instead, I stood, wiping my hands on a rag and meeting his gaze for the first time. "Options?" I asked, letting the word hang in the air like a challenge. Richard's smirk widened. "Yes, options. You can sign these documents now and save yourself a lot of trouble, or you can resist and make things infinitely harder for yourself. Believe me, Tom, you don't want to go down that road. My lawyers will bury you." I stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could see the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. For all his bravado, the man was nervous. He just didn't know it yet. "You think you're the big man here, don't you?" I said quietly. "You walk in here, waving your fancy papers around, thinking you've already won. But let me tell you something, Richard. This isn't your office, and I'm not one of your clients." Richard chuckled, but it was forced. "Tom, I understand you're upset, but let's keep this civil. I'm giving you an opportunity to walk away with some dignity." "Dignity?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You want to talk to me about dignity? You, a man who sneaks around with another man's wife and thinks he's entitled to everything that man has built? Let me show you what dignity looks like." Before Richard could react, my right hand shot out, connecting with his jaw in a punch that sent him staggering backward. The sound of it echoed through the workshop like a gunshot. He hit the wall, his briefcase clattering to the floor, papers scattering everywhere. "What the hell?" he started, but I didn't let him finish. I grabbed him by the collar, hauling him to his feet, and delivered an uppercut to his midsection that knocked the wind out of him. He doubled over, gasping for air, his face a mix of shock and pain. "You wanted to see what a simple mechanic can do?" I said, my voice cold. "Consider this your lesson." Richard tried to stand, but I wasn't done. My steel-toed boot connected with his ribs, sending him sprawling to the floor. The satisfying crunch of bone was a sound I'd never forget. He groaned, clutching his side, but he didn't beg. Not yet. I crouched down, grabbing him by the tie and forcing him to look at me. "You walk into my life, my home, and try to take everything I've worked for, everything I love, and you think I'm just going to roll over and take it? You don't know a damn thing about me, Richard, but you're about to learn." "Tom," he gasped, his voice barely above a whisper, "you're making a mistake. You can't just—" I cut him off, my grip tightening. "The only mistake here is you thinking you're an alpha male. Let me tell you what that really means. An alpha doesn't hide behind lawyers and contracts. He doesn't sneak around with another man's wife and call it power. An alpha stands his ground, protects what's his, and doesn't back down from a fight. And you're just a scared little boy in a suit." I released him, letting him collapse to the floor. For a moment, the only sound was his labored breathing. Then, slowly, he tried to push himself up, but I stepped on his hand, pinning it to the ground. He let out a strangled cry, and I leaned down, my voice low and steady. "Here's how this is going to go," I said. "You're going to walk out of here and think long and hard about your next move. You go to the police, and I'll tell them exactly what you've been up to. You try to come after me or my family again, and I'll finish what I started. Do you understand me?" He nodded, tears streaming down his face, his earlier confidence shattered. "Good," I said, stepping back. "Now get the hell out of my workshop." Richard scrambled to his feet, clutching his broken ribs, and staggered toward the door. As he left, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in days, I felt like I was in control. Richard thought he could intimidate me, but he learned the hard way that there's more to a man than his job title or his bank account. As I watched him disappear down the driveway, I couldn't help but smile. This fight wasn't over, but it was a fight I was ready for. When Richard left my workshop bruised, humiliated, and whimpering, I knew it was only a matter of time before Claire heard about it. I didn't have to wait long. That same evening, while I was under the hood of a pickup truck, her car screeched into the driveway. She slammed the car door with enough force to make the neighbors turn their heads and stormed into the workshop like a thundercloud. "Tom!" she yelled, her voice sharp and shrill. "What did you do?" I wiped my hands on a rag and straightened up, calm as ever. "Evening, Claire," I said. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Her face was a mixture of fury and panic, but behind all of that, I saw something else: fear. She wasn't just angry, she was scared. Scared because the narrative she'd built so carefully with Richard was starting to crumble. "Don't you dare play dumb with me," she snapped. "Richard just called me from the hospital. He says you attacked him." "I didn't attack him," I said, my voice steady. "I taught him a lesson. There's a difference." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "A lesson? Are you out of your mind? Do you have any idea what you've done? He could press charges, Tom. He could ruin you." I shrugged, leaning against the workbench. "Let him try. I'm not the one who walked into someone else's workshop, waved a stack of legal threats around, and acted like I owned the place. He underestimated me, Claire, just like you did." She flinched at that, and for a moment, she looked almost guilty. Almost. But then the mask slipped back into place, and she crossed her arms, trying to regain the upper hand. "This isn't about you, Tom. This is about our family. About what's best for everyone." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed through the workshop. "Our family? Don't you dare stand there and pretend this is about our family. If you cared about our family, you wouldn't have crawled into bed with Richard in the first place." "That's not fair," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't understand." "No, Claire, you don't understand," I interrupted. "You don't get to throw away 25 years of marriage and then act like the victim when it blows up in your face. You made your choice, and now you're dealing with the consequences." For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just stood there, her eyes darting around the workshop as if looking for an escape. Finally, she sighed and sat down on an old stool, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't want it to be like this," she said quietly. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Could have fooled me," I muttered, crossing my arms. She looked up at me, tears brimming in her eyes. "Tom, please. This isn't easy for me either. I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted something more." There it was again. That word. More. It was like a knife twisting in my chest every time she said it. "You wanted more," I said, my voice cold. "And now you've got it. Congratulations, Claire. You've traded a husband who loved you for a man who treats you like a trophy. I hope it's everything you dreamed of." She flinched again, but she didn't argue. Instead, she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy for her. But then I remembered the way she had looked at Richard that morning when she thought I wasn't watching. The way she had defended him, even after everything he'd done. "What do you want from me, Claire?" I asked, my voice softer now. "Why are you really here?" She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. "I don't know," she admitted. I thought maybe we could fix this. That maybe, somehow, we could go back to the way things were." I shook my head. "You don't get it, do you? There's no going back. You made your choice, and so did I. You wanted something more, and now you've got it. But don't come crawling back to me when it all falls apart." Her face crumpled, and she stood, brushing past me as she headed for the door. "I'll go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this isn't over, Tom. It's never over." As the door slammed behind her, I leaned against the workbench, letting out a long breath. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't over. But one thing was certain. I wasn't the same man I had been yesterday. Richard and Claire had thought they could tear me down, but all they'd done was light a fire in me. A fire that wouldn't be extinguished anytime soon. When Claire stormed out of my workshop that night, I thought I'd seen the last of her for a while. I figured she needed time to regroup, maybe to figure out her next play with Richard. What I didn't expect was how quickly Richard's so-called loyalty would fall apart when the chips were down. It started the next morning. I was tightening bolts on a rusted-out engine when my phone buzzed on the workbench. Normally, I'd ignore calls during work hours, but something told me to check this one. It was Claire. "Tom," she said, her voice shaky. "I need to talk to you." I didn't say anything right away. Part of me wanted to hang up, but the other part was curious. "I thought we said everything we needed to last night," I finally said. "No, this is different," she replied. "It's about Richard." I froze. "What about him?" There was a pause, and then she sighed heavily. "He fired me, Tom. He said he can't be associated with me anymore. That you're too much of a liability." I leaned against the workbench, letting her words sink in. Fired? Richard? The man who strutted into my workshop acting like he owned the world? I'd told him I'd teach him a lesson, but I hadn't expected him to fold this fast. "What do you mean? He fired you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "He said it's for my own protection," Claire said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "That if he keeps me on, it'll give you more ammunition to come after him. He offered me severance, but it's not enough. And he told me not to contact him again." I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, hollow sound. So the big, bad Richard turned tail and ran the moment things got tough. Color me shocked. "This isn't funny, Tom," she snapped. "I'm out of a job. I have no income, no savings. He's frozen all the joint accounts, and I can't even access my credit cards. I don't know what to do." "Sounds like a you problem," I said, my voice cold. "You made your bed, Claire. Now you get to lie in it." "Tom, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you. I know I made mistakes. But I didn't think it would end like this. He promised me everything. Security, a future, even love. And now he's gone." "Welcome to reality," I said. "Richard never cared about you. You were just a trophy to him, a way to stroke his own ego. The moment you stopped being useful, he dropped you. And now you're crawling back to me, hoping I'll clean up your mess." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought she'd hung up. But then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Her words should have softened me, but they didn't. If anything, they hardened my resolve. For years, I had been her safety net, the person she turned to whenever things got tough. But not this time. This time, she was on her own. "I'm sorry, Claire," I said, and for the first time, I meant it. "But I can't help you. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." She started to say something, but I ended the call before she could. I set the phone down and took a deep breath, trying to process what had just happened. Claire, the woman who had spent years building a life with me, had thrown it all away for a man who saw her as nothing more than a pawn. And now, she was paying the price. As the day went on, I couldn't help but think about Richard. I wondered if he was sitting in his fancy office, nursing his bruises and plotting his next move. But deep down, I knew the truth. He was scared. He might have money and lawyers, but he didn't have the guts to face me again. He was a coward, plain and simple. By the time the sun set, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Claire might be in crisis, and Richard might be licking his wounds, but I was still standing. They had tried to break me, to take everything I'd worked for, but they had underestimated me. And now, they were the ones who were falling apart. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. Not because everything was resolved, far from it, but because I knew I had the strength to face whatever came next. Richard had played his hand, and Claire had made her choice. Now, it was my turn. The phone calls stopped after that day. For the first time in decades, the woman who used to call me about everything, whether it was asking me to pick up milk on my way home or sharing her latest courtroom win, had nothing more to say to me. And I didn't miss it. Not at first. But it wasn't long before I started hearing things from mutual acquaintances. Small-town mechanics like me always hear things. Claire had moved in with her sister, Emily, in the city. I knew Emily well enough to know she wouldn't take kindly to being a long-term refuge, especially for someone like Claire, who'd walked into this mess with her eyes wide open. Claire, the lawyer, the brilliant, capable woman who had spent years arguing cases and winning over juries, was now a guest in her sister's house, living out of suitcases and relying on handouts. I wish I could say I felt sorry for her. Maybe a part of me did, buried deep beneath the anger and betrayal. But mostly, I felt vindicated. It wasn't long before the cracks began to show. One evening, I got a call from our daughter, Abby. "Dad," she said, her voice hesitant. "Mom's been trying to call me and Dylan. Have you talked to her?" "No," I said simply, wiping grease off my hands. "And I'm not planning to." There was a pause, the kind that told me she was choosing her words carefully. "She's been asking if she can come stay with us." Dylan said no. I haven't answered yet. That caught me off guard. Abby and Dylan had always been closer to Claire than to me, especially during their teenage years when she was the cool parent, the one who understood their struggles while I was busy keeping a roof over their heads. If they were shutting her out now, it meant they'd seen through her act. "You don't owe her anything, Abby," I said after a moment. "She made her choices. Now she has to live with them." "I know," she said quietly, "but it's hard. She's our mom." "Yeah," I said, my voice softening. "And she's also the woman who blew up our family for some guy who's already left her. Don't let her guilt you into cleaning up her mess." Abby sighed. "I'll think about it." "Thanks, Dad." The call ended, and for a long time, I sat there, staring at the empty workshop. It wasn't easy hearing that Claire had tried to turn our kids into her safety net, but at the same time, it felt like validation. For years, she had been the star of the family, the one who seemed to hold everything together. Now, the truth was finally coming out. Days turned into weeks, and I heard less and less about Claire. I stayed busy with work, pouring my energy into fixing cars and rebuilding engines. But every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about her, wondering how she was holding up. I hated myself for caring, but old habits die hard. One evening, just as I was locking up the workshop, I saw a familiar figure standing at the end of the driveway. Claire. She looked nothing like the confident woman I had married. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She was clutching a small handbag, the kind that looked like it held everything she owned. "Tom," she said, her voice barely audible. I didn't know where else to go. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "What do you want, Claire?" Her shoulders sagged, and she looked down at the ground. "I need help." "Help?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's rich coming from you. The last time you needed help, you went to Richard. How'd that work out for you?" She flinched, but she didn't argue. "I know I hurt you, Tom. I know I don't deserve your kindness. But I'm out of options. I don't have anywhere else to go." There was a time when I would have caved, when I would have taken her in and tried to fix everything, no matter how much it hurt. But that time was long gone. I had learned the hard way that some people only come back when they've burned every other bridge. "I'm sorry, Claire," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "But I can't help you. You made your choice and I made mine. This is your mess to clean up." She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Tom, please. I've lost everything. I just need a place to stay for a few days. Just until I can figure things out." I shook my head. "You've got family, Claire. You've got friends. You've got options. But you don't have me. Not anymore." She didn't argue. She didn't yell or scream. She just nodded, a defeated look in her eyes, and turned to leave. As I watched her walk away, part of me felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by a sense of relief. For the first time in years, I felt free. Claire had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. And for once, I wasn't going to be the one to pick up the pieces. The silence in the house was deafening. For 25 years, every creak of the floorboards and hum of the refrigerator had been accompanied by Claire's presence. Her laughter, her scolding, her stories about work. Now, it was just me. But instead of loneliness, I felt peace. The first few days were strange, I won't lie. I woke up expecting to hear her rummaging in the kitchen or complaining about the coffee I brewed. It took time to adjust to the quiet, to the absence of her voice echoing through the house. But slowly, the emptiness began to feel less like a void and more like space. Space to breathe, to think, and to rediscover who I was outside of being Claire's husband. I threw myself into my work. Cars have always been my refuge. There's something about the hum of an engine, the smell of oil and grease, that clears my mind like nothing else. In the weeks after Claire left, I took on more clients than ever, working late into the night and filling my days with the steady rhythm of bolts turning and engines revving. But it wasn't just about staying busy. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to anyone else. This business, my business, was a testament to everything I had built with my own two hands. Every satisfied customer, every successful repair, was proof that I was more than just a simple mechanic. I was a provider, a creator, and, above all, a survivor. Word spread quickly about what had happened. In a small town, news travels faster than AV8 on an open highway. People came by the shop, not just for repairs but to check on me, to share their own stories of betrayal or loss. I learned that I wasn't alone, that so many others had faced similar heartbreak and come out the other side stronger. One day, Mrs. Callahan, an elderly widow who had been bringing her car to me for years, stopped by. She handed me a tin of cookies and patted my shoulder. "You're a good man, Tom," she said. "Don't let anyone make you forget that." Her words stayed with me long after she left. I realized that for so long, I had defined myself through Claire's eyes, trying to be the man she wanted, the husband she needed. But I wasn't living for her anymore. I was living for me. I started making changes, small at first. I cleared out the bedroom, packing up the remnants of Claire's presence and storing them in the attic. It was hard, seeing her clothes, her books, her little trinkets, but it was necessary. This was my space now, and I needed to reclaim it. I also began reconnecting with old friends. Guys I hadn't seen since high school stopped by the shop, and we'd talk for hours after closing time. We laughed about the good old days, shared stories about our families, and reminded each other that life goes on, no matter how many curveballs it throws. But the biggest change came one sunny afternoon when I decided to treat myself to something I'd always wanted, a classic car. I'd spent years fixing other people's vehicles, but I'd never had one of my own. That day, I bought an old Mustang, rusted and beat up but full of potential. It was a project, a symbol of my new beginning. Every evening, I worked on it, sanding down the rust, replacing parts, and watching it transform piece by piece. It became a metaphor for my own journey, broken but reparable, abandoned but not forgotten. My relationship with Abby and Dylan also shifted. For years, I had felt like a background character in their lives, overshadowed by Claire's larger-than-life presence. But now, they saw me differently. They called more often, visited the shop, and even helped me with the Mustang. It wasn't just about fixing a car, it was about rebuilding our bond as a family. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Abby sat beside me on the porch, sipping sweet tea. She glanced at the Mustang in the driveway, its new paint job gleaming in the fading light. "You've really turned it around, Dad," she said. "Yeah," I replied, smiling. "It's amazing what you can do when you stop worrying about what other people think." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and understanding. "I'm glad you're okay," she said softly. "I was worried about you." "I'm okay," I said, and for the first time in a long time, I truly meant it. Life wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. I had my work, my kids, and a newfound sense of self-worth that no one could take away. Claire and Richard had tried to tear me down, but all they'd done was remind me of what I was capable of. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. This was my life now, imperfect, messy, but undeniably mine. And for the first time in years, I couldn't wait to see what came next. Claire's fall from grace was as complete as it was inevitable. Penniless and abandoned, she found herself stranded on a roadside, her car out of gas and her pride long gone. She had tried reaching out to Abby and Dylan, but they had stopped answering her calls, their resentment for her betrayal outweighing any sympathy they might have felt. Her last desperate option was hitchhiking, and as she stood there with her thumb out, a battered van slowed to a stop. The driver, a predator with a crooked smile, saw an easy target. Claire, once a formidable lawyer with a thriving career, was now vulnerable and alone. She climbed into the van, unaware of the danger she had just stepped into. Her choices had led her here, to this moment, a harsh and unforgiving reflection of everything she had thrown away. As the van disappeared down the empty road, I sat on my porch, gazing at the stars. For me, the future was clear and full of promise. For Claire, the road ahead was shrouded in darkness.